Hey everyone, today we're jumping right into something pretty fascinating. We're looking at exactly how American identity was built. But we aren't just going to look at dry dates and old battles. We are exploring this evolution through two incredibly powerful everyday lenses: the stories people told and the food they ate. Because the entire premise of this explainer is actually simple but really profound. American culture was constructed simultaneously on the page and on the plate.
Okay, let's dive into this with a question that honestly might sound a little absurd at first glance. What does a flash-frozen TV dinner have in common with the literature of Ernest Hemingway? I know, it almost sounds like a punchline, but stick with me, because by the end of our time together, you'll see exactly how the sterile convenience of 20th century mass-produced food and the deep skepticism of modernist literature actually sprang from the exact same cultural shifts. We're going to get there, for sure.
To understand this connection, we are tracing over 400 years of history across four distinct eras. First up, Native origins, then the Colonial era, third, the 19th century, and finally, the 20th century.
Now, as we step through this timeline together, I really want you to pay close attention to how the physical environment and the unique historical context of each era literally shaped both the literary movements and the everyday culinary realities of the people living through it.
All right, kicking things off with era number 1, Native origins, land and legends.
Way before Europeans showed up, Native American life was just profoundly, deeply connected to the diverse bioregions of the continent. The absolute foundation for a lot of tribes was a brilliant agricultural practice known as the Three Sisters. Basically, this was the companion planting of beans, maize, and squash. This incredibly harmonious approach to agriculture created a super stable, nutritious diet. In fact, this was documented as early as the 1620s by figures like William Bradford. He wrote about Squanto, teaching colonists this very specific regional method of burying fish in a mount with seeds just to improve the soil.
But, they didn't just farm. They foraged and hunted with mind-blowing regional variety. Northern tribes like the Ojibwe hunted moose. Down in the subtropical swamps of the south, the Choctaw hunted snapping turtles. Over on the East Coast, blue crabs were a major staple, while out west, tribes were fishing for massive sturgeon. And their cooking methods were equally resourceful. They often used something called stone boiling. This is where rocks were heated in a fire and then dropped directly into water-filled pots to cook meat and veggies. I mean, just imagine the incredibly rich, earthy smells of that entire process.
Now, what's really fascinating here is how these survival methods connected directly to their stories. Just as their diets relied entirely on the natural cycles of the land, their rich oral storytelling traditions were deeply rooted in their physical world. Native folk tales and creation myths heavily utilized the repetition of culturally significant numbers. Specifically, they used 4, representing the cardinal directions, and 7, which represented those cardinal directions, plus skyward, earthward, and the center. So their literature and their food were both literally tethered to the physical compass of their environment.
Moving right along to our second era, the Colonial era, survival and adaptation. And this brilliantly illustrates the intense cultural tension of the 1600s. The arrival of Europeans triggered a seriously harsh reality of survival. On one hand, you have the literary output of the colonists, these highly practical, heavily religious texts by Puritan ministers like Increase Mather, who were hyper-focused on spiritual survival. But then, on the other hand, you have the stark culinary reality of physical survival. English colonists realized pretty quickly they couldn't just grow their familiar wheat for bread. It just didn't work. Instead, they had to adapt, substituting wheat with local native cornmeal to make johnny cakes. It was a desperate era defined by the sheer, practical need to sustain both the soul and the body.
As the colonies established trade, though, things got a bit more complicated, and honestly, a bit funnier. Just take a look at this rant from a 1747 cookbook by Hannah Glass. She is absolutely furious about the rising influence of French cooking. It perfectly highlights the cultural tensions brewing at the time. But beyond the drama, the colonial diet was actually changing rapidly because of global trade. And tragically, the transatlantic slave trade introduced ingredients like molasses from the West Indies, along with West African staples like peanuts, sweet potatoes, and yams. These additions deeply, permanently shaped what would eventually become Southern cuisine.
Which brings us to Section 3, the 19th century, farmhouses and fiction.
Now, the 19th century was totally defined by a growing sense of independence and westward expansion. And in literature, this fierce independence sparked Transcendentalism. Authors like Henry David Thoreau really championed this profound individualism. They believed that transcending the corrupting influence of society was what actually unlocked human goodness. Thoreau's famous book, Walden, which is all about living independently out in nature, perfectly captured the ultimate spirit of the 19th century self-reliant American.
And what exactly fueled all that rugged self-reliance? Well, the 19th century farmhouse diet was pragmatic, very seasonal, and incredibly calorie-dense. We're talking fried salt pork with milk gravy, simmered green beans, and thick winter buckwheat cakes. They relied heavily on preserving their own foods through pickling, making massive batches of apple butter, and churning their own butter. Oh, and the pies. Depending on the season, they were baking rhubarb, cherry, or apple pies, and sometimes eating them literally 3 times a day. It was a diet built from the ground up on total self-sufficiency.
But, not everyone was quite so optimistic about all this frontier isolation. While the Transcendentalists were out there celebrating nature, the American Gothic writers were essentially writing dark critique tracts to all that optimism. Authors like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Edgar Allan Poe heavily drew on frontier anxiety. They explored the intense fear of the unknown that lurked just beyond the safety of that self-sufficient farmhouse door. The sunny optimism of the farm was constantly stalked by the shadows of the woods.
Finally, we land in Section 4, the 20th century, Modernity and meals.
This era was incredibly fast-paced, entirely revolutionized by industrialization and a massive shift toward urban living. Just look at how science transformed something as simple as milk. Step 1, milking machines drastically lowered production cost. Step 2, scientific pasteurization came in to ensure safety. And Step 3, new packaging like glass bottles and cartons finally allowed for mass distribution directly into urban centers. Everyday farm items were completely transformed into year-round, standardized urban staples. We are looking at the literal birth of mass-produced culture.
So the crucial point is how this exact industrialization affected the American psyche, which finally brings us all the way back to our opening question. Following World War I, the Lost Generation writers, like Ernest Hemingway, expressed deep skepticism, pain, and a real loss of direction in a literary movement we call Modernism. At the exact same time, the food industry was shifting heavily towards sterile, scientific convenience. Urban Americans were suddenly eating canned tomato bisque and eventually those flash-frozen TV dinners. The deep alienation found in modernist novels perfectly, almost poetically, mirrored the increasingly processed, disconnected convenience of the modern American diet.
The core takeaway from all of this is pretty profound. Whether it was early Native Americans carefully preserving meat in pemmican to survive a brutal winter, or post-war authors publishing subversive postmodern literature just to make sense of a fractured world, Americans have constantly used their food and their words to navigate who they are. They aren't just hobbies or calories, they are a direct reflection of the changing human experience.
I want to leave you with this final, rather provocative thought. We've seen how centuries of complex history are literally baked into bread and written into novels. So take a look at your own plate today, and take a look at the media you're consuming. If our history is truly written in what we read and what we eat, what will today's culture say about us to the historians of tomorrow? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.